Hey guys, welcome back to another video. I'm Sarah from Who I Am Among the Pages, and this video is pre-recorded. It'll be recorded about a week before you see it, but I'm getting ready to go away, and I just wanted to make sure that, especially just starting out, that I could stick to the upload schedule every Wednesday. So if you're new here, hello, and if you're not, welcome back. Today I wanted to do a video on my favorite books of all time. I feel like that's a pretty good way to start out the first video that's not a total introduction. So before I get started, I wanted to do a brief reading update on Drums of Autumn. I'm only 9 pages into it, but I have to say one thing that immediately stood out, that has stood out in all of her other books, mild spoilers, so if you don't want to hear this, I'll put a timestamp in the description box down below. And just skip to that point. One thing I absolutely love about Claire and Jamie's relationship is just how believable it is. I mean, we just saw a hanging. The first chapter is called A Hanging in Eden. So it gives us the impression that, they're somewhere perfect. And in reality, they're not. But, just being together, it's perfect. And the fact that they just saw something really horrendous, and it was one of Jamie's friends, and yet they're leaning on each other to kind of get through that. Claire knows something's wrong, so she's very aware of it, and she's also very aware of Jamie forcibly pushing that down in order to make the passage for young Ian, to get back to Scotland. And I think that's really incredible that she's able to do that, because they come across like a couple that's been married for years, a couple that just loves each other to pieces. And yeah, I have to say, it's one of my very favorite things about these books. Like, the plot, of course, it just fires on and on. I love it to pieces. But that is one of the most impressive things, is the realism. And I mean, the fact that this book is set almost 300 years ago, and it's still so believable and so relatable. Like, she didn't even have to write it in the 21st century in a setting that we're familiar with for it to be good, for it to be a believable romance. And for that, I think there is endless props to give, because I am not the best romance writer by any stretch of the imagination. So cannot wait to read more of this. I've loved all three of the first 3 books. Again, I'm 9 pages in, but would highly recommend. So, getting on to the portion of the video talking about my favorite books of all time, I tried to narrow it down. Like, I've been reading since I was a little kid. I have plenty of books that I really adore. These are just the ones that really stood out to me. I tried to pick ones from different genres. Didn't do so well, but so here we go. These aren't in any particular order, by the way. So, the first one is Christine by Stephen King. Yeah, this copy's been through the ringer. I got it for 50 cents at the library sale, so. But, this was, I believe, the first book of his that I ever read. It was either that or Salem's Lot, but I'm pretty sure this was the first one. I was in high school. I wasn't that old. I think I was 15, maybe 16 years old when I read it. And I've always had a thing for, vintage things. Like, I love things from the 1980s, like from when my parents were teenagers, and back well into the 50s. I love that. Of course, the 40s, the war era, I love. And of course, it's a 57 Plymouth Fury. That's Christine. That's the haunted car. And I just really love the fact that he took such an iconic car that's beautiful. I mean, I don't think that's arguable. It made it into something so horrific. And it really took, like, kind of a beautiful relationship between a man and his car and made it something horrendous. And I really liked the characters. Like, one thing I have to say about Stephen King writing teenage characters is, again, with like Diana Gabaldon with the romance, is how believable they are. Like, they talk and they behave like teenagers. I mean, granted, I was not a teenager in the 1980s, or the 1980s, when this was set, but you still, like, even though some of the things they do are so much different from how the ones of us that were 2000s kids grew up, it's still so relatable. And I think the fact that all the characters are so relatable is what makes this even scarier, because there's nothing really out of the ordinary about two friends. One's a little weird, gets this wonderful car, and then, I don't want to spoil it, but bad things happen. Like, I think it's been out long enough that that's enough. But yeah, really, really great. Really captures what it's like to be a teenager with a really horrific twist. And it's a very not far-fetched horrific twist. I think that's also what makes this so freaky, is because the whole world didn't end. There's no zombie apocalypse. There's no plague around. It's just one issue that ends up destroying these kids' lives. So 5 out of 5 stars. Loved it then. I would love to reread it because it's been a couple years, but I can't imagine that my opinion will have changed. So definitely read this if you haven't already. The next one is a childhood favorite, and yeah, this book has been through the ringer. I'd like to know how many times I've read it. And my sister is also a huge Harry Potter fan. So without further ado, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Of course, by J.K. Rowling. When I was in elementary school, I don't remember what year in particular. I was young, very young, when I read these. And I actually started off, I read the second book first, because when I went to the school library, the first book was out. Somebody else had started it too. So, I started out with the second book, 10 pages, and I was in love. I loved Harry. Harry was like my first romance. I loved that kid. And I saw a lot of myself in Hermione, and I was really just so captivated by Hogwarts and the idea of being taken out of your circumstance. Like, I had a wonderful childhood, but it was still just the idea of being taken out of the ordinary and being something extraordinary that really fascinated me. You know, without getting into it, I imagine that's why I loved Percy Jackson too, because it was the same sort of thing about this ordinary kid being something incredible. So it was really hard to pick a favorite of this series, but I have to say it's the Goblet of Fire for me, just because I really enjoyed the length of it. I love a long book. I know that's kind of an unpopular opinion with some people, but for me, it's definitely my thing. I just loved how there's so many points of contention through the book. I don't want to spoil it in case anybody hasn't read it. Which I know there are some people that are like college age that I mean, I was born kind of getting out of the Harry Potter generation. I was the tail end of it. But still, there's some people our age that haven't read it. But just the fact that there's so many points of contention with what happens while they're at the Triwizard Tournament. I really loved what was I say? I really loved the whole Quidditch and just everything that happened. And like, you had the Triwizard Tournament, you had what happened at the Quidditch match. And I felt like this was the book where Harry really came into himself. Like, it took a couple books. The first book he's 11 years old, second he's 12, third he's 13. 13 I think is when a lot of us kind of flip out and forget how to act, how to be. So by the time he was this age, he really started to become who he was for the rest of the books. And I just really enjoyed all the characters, like how they acted. I felt like this was the solid book. The most solid. One of them anyway. So yeah, if you haven't read the Harry Potter series, definitely read it. But this is my favorite of all of them. So the next book is actually a really recent read, unlike the other two. I started this in December of 2018 and finished it in January of this year. And I didn't mention this in my first video when I was talking about the kinds of books I really like. One of my favorites, actually, I don't know how I forgot this, is historical fiction. I love it, especially historical fiction set in the 18th century, especially in England, Scotland, and America. I love Revolution fiction, either from the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And partial to the American Revolution, though, of course. So this book is My Dear Hamilton by Stephanie Dray and Laura, I'm going to butcher this, I'm sorry, Kemoy. You can kind of see it there. Maybe somebody else knows how to say it. If you do know how to say it, comment below, because I am terrible with pronunciations, especially when it comes to names. This book just really, really fascinated me, because if you don't know what it is, it's basically Hamilton's professional life, like as a politician, as a speaker, as a revolutionary, as in the military, and really just through his professional life up until his death, and then it goes on after his death, because it's Elizabeth's life, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. It starts with her, I believe it starts with her as a young teenager. Yeah. And then it picks up with her meeting him, and it really, I'm sure, I know it romanticizes things, but how things probably were anyway. But it goes into like somebody meeting the guy they love for the first time. But then there's also, besides the romance and the tender moments, there's also a lot of the politics of the time, and I really liked that, and seeing Eliza's opinions on him, because, and at least in this book, Hamilton was fairly happy and allowed her to be open with her own opinions, and he was happy that she had them, versus a lot of women at the time that were very, okay, well, whatever my husband says is good. But I had a lot of appreciation for that, and really, it was just such a solid read, because it goes from, it's from Eliza's heart, you can really tell, and I really found a lot of myself in her, and I just really appreciated that. I love, one of my favorite things in a book is when I can really relate to the main character, and I think that's partially why I really enjoy reading books with a female lead. You know, I have nothing wrong with books with a male lead. Obviously, Harry Potter is one of my favorite things. But especially as I've gotten older, I really enjoy when I can find a book with a relatable lead, and it just so happens it tends to be women. But solid read. It's really interesting to see Hamilton's life through the eyes of his wife, who he, of course, he had affairs with other women while he was married to her. You see the politics of the time through a very intelligent woman's eyes. It really does a good job at clearly portraying what loss and grief and very difficult things are truly like. And, of course, I'm not a mother, but there's a lot of her struggles with being a parent in here, too. And I really enjoyed reading that. It's actually, it doesn't look very long, but it's around 600 pages, 619. So it's actually a fairly long read. There are parts, if you're not into political intrigue, especially centuries ago, might not be your thing. It's definitely very heavy historical fiction. But if it is your thing, I very much recommend. And I believe it was the same duo of authors. They wrote another book called America's First Daughter. It's Thomas Jefferson's daughter. Really want to read that. Of course, you know, 5,000 other books I want to read. So, but 10 out of 10 would recommend. So the next one is a little bit of a dumb. Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. This is actually my signed edition. I just want to put that out there, that the queen touched this. Anyway, I talked about this in the last video, so I'm going to make it brief. If you know, you don't want to listen to this and you just want to hear the original explanation, I'll put the link in the former video below in the description box. But, you know, follows Claire Randall, who falls back in time after coming home from World War II. And I just really love it because, again, the realistic romance. I found a lot of myself in Claire, like with Eliza Hamilton and My Dear Hamilton. And there's a lot of politics. There's a lot of really, really suspenseful action, and the plot moves very quickly. I really enjoy that. And she manages to balance very rich, in-depth characters with a very fast-paced plot. I mean, it's like watching a movie. You can't put it down. You know, the edition I read originally, this little paperback, has been read to death. And it's marked up, because I do that to books. I'm huge into highlighting and putting notes, and I don't think this one has it, but it has sticky notes, page tabs, all sorts of things. Now, that copy's been read to death. It's around 1,000 pages. I think it might be 800 something. Read it in like a week, no problem. It's such a good book. Once you get into it, there's no backing out. So, if you read nothing else on this list, read Outlander. And my last book, I do understand why people don't read it, because it does portray slavery in a much different way than, especially Americans, than we're taught in school. I'm not defending that. Don't, of course, don't condone it. But, nonetheless, Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. And this is a classic. It was written in 1934, I believe. 1936 was the first publication. And it was then made into a movie in 1939 with Vivian Leigh as Scarlett O'Hara, Clark Gable as Rhett Butler, and then you had Olivia de Havilland, who's still alive, by the way. She is still kicking, still beautiful, still wonderful, still amazing, as Melanie Hamilton. So they had some really beautiful big names for the main characters, and the movie's cast perfectly. If you're not into reading a well over 1,000-page book, totally get it. It's very dense, and it's written in a more classical style, so it can be difficult to get through, especially for young readers. I tried to read it for the first time when I was like 11 or 12. Couldn't get through it. I was older. I was 15 or 16 when I read it all the way through. Definitely go watch the movie, though, if you don't want to read the book, because it's close enough that you can still get a good idea of it. But this follows Scarlett O'Hara, who is the traditional, she's a spoiled brat. She is a spoiled brat plantation heiress in Georgia, and it starts out right before Georgia seceded from the Union in the American Civil War. So, her biggest concern, of course, is that a guy from the next plantation over doesn't want her, is going to marry this other girl who she thinks is just terrible, despite all the boys fawning over her. So that's her biggest issue. War breaks out, and of course, you see the Civil War through the eyes of a Southerner, which is something much different than I think a lot of books tend to do. Things are romanticized. Things weren't, this wasn't written as a original account of the war by any means, but it's a very unique perspective, and it's a very unique main character. She's really, especially in the beginning, she is really unlikable. But somehow she manages to write this so that you eventually do like her. And that you see her development. And then the ending, again, this book has been out for long enough that I'm sure I'm not spoiling anything for anybody that really cares. But it has a very realistic ending, and I really appreciate that, even though I wish things had ended differently for her, because by the end you do sort of at least have sympathy for her, but it doesn't. Very realistic ending, and I really appreciate that in any sort of book, but especially one set in such a rough time, because it does go through the beginning of the Civil War, through the war, and then well into Reconstruction. She's 16 when the book takes off, when the story starts. It's through her several marriages, which of course she was 16. That wasn't unusual, but it's shocking to kind of read a 16-year-old's perspective on what it's like to be married to someone she doesn't want to be. And it goes well into Reconstruction, which isn't, actually, surprisingly enough, isn't a period that's covered much, at least where I went to school. So it's really interesting to see that detailed from a specific point of view, because honestly, I really didn't know a whole lot about it, especially when I started reading it. I think she's 30-something by the time the book ends, so that gives you a real good idea about the length of time that's covered in this. So yeah, those are my favorite books of all time. as well as a somewhat update on Drums of Autumn, even though I just started it. But I will be away this next week, so like I said, this video is pre-recorded. I don't like doing that. I don't want to make a habit of it, but I do want to stick to the upload schedule. So, thank you guys for watching. So, comment, rate, subscribe. Is that what people normally say? Wait, what's the thing about the little bell notification? Do that, whatever it is. See you guys.